Our world is growing. As population growth continues to rise and wealth increases, so does the demand for food, feed, and fuel. Traditional resources are depleting, and the demand for sustainable ingredients is growing. That's where we come in. We are committed to help meet that demand, as we believe that nature has significantly more to offer than we currently use. We believe that we can maximize the use of natural resources by continuously improving ourselves, our processes, and our products. Giving nature a second life is our second nature. With our roots dating back to the late 19th century, we have evolved from a small rendering company into the world's leading innovative developer and producer of sustainable organic ingredients for a growing population. Our unique broad product and service portfolio is active all over the world, customized for high-end markets and local needs. Each day, our dedicated employees live what we all believe. We serve society by maximizing nature's value so that people stay healthy, homes stay warm, children stay happy, dogs and trucks keep running, and farmers can flourish, not just today, but infinitely. We are Darling Ingredients.
Our next presentation, Meat Case Trends and Analysis, we welcome Anne-Marie Roerink, who is the principal and founder of 210 Analytics and specializes in quantitative and qualitative market research. Prior to launching 210 Analytics, she served as the director for research for the Food Marketing Institute. Anne-Marie has also served as the director of marketing and research for the American Society of Travel Agents and oversaw all primary and secondary research efforts. Please join me in welcoming Anne-Marie Roerink.
All right, off we go. Well, I completely echo everything that was just said in the commercial. As an industry, everybody on the phone with us today, you've done a tremendous job in keeping food on the table, and meat played an extremely big role in that, as we'll see here in a minute. The last few months have been an incredible roller coaster, I think, for all of us professionally and personally as well, where some of you guys might have been in the same place as I was early March, which was the annual meat conference. And there we were hit with a tornado very, very close to the hotel. And I think many of us thought that that would be the strangest event of the year. But it turned out to be kind of a blip on the radar with everything else that started to happen. So very early on in March, we saw two gigantic weeks, and I'll show you the trends line here in a little bit. And ever since, we've just seen very, very strong everyday and holiday sales in the total retail space, but especially in meat as well. And if we look forward to the next few months, especially with the reoccurrence of the COVID cases in many states, then I think we're going to see elevated demand in the meat retail space for a long time to come. So here's what you're looking at since about March 1st all the way to early July. So the blue line is what we call the trip index. So that shows how often people went to the store versus how many times they went last year. So as you can see in those early weeks of March, that's when people raced from store to store to store to try and figure out where to buy their toilet paper and their canned goods and their meat as well. But as you can see, we set far above the number of trips that we were taking. And then shelter in place started to jump in, and you see in April and May and June that the trips actually were very flat. So we don't have a lot of people in the store, but when they are in the store, they are buying enormous baskets. And just the channel that has really benefited from that is the traditional grocery channel, because people don't want to go to several different stores. So we're seeing people go to the traditional grocery store and buy their basket for the entire week. So this is something that we have not seen in really any near future, a near past of the grocery retailing space. And a lot of reporters ask me, have we ever seen weeks like we saw? And I'll show you this right here. So this shows you what the sales was relative to the same week year ago. So especially if you look at the weeks of March 15 and the week of March 22nd, total store food and beverage, so that's everything that sits in those center store aisles, they were 81%, between 79 and 81% against what they sold last year. You'll see the meat numbers here in a minute, and we actually went higher than that. So a lot of reporters ask me, have we ever seen anything like it? And the answer is simply no. Of course, we've all been preparing for things like hurricanes or blizzards, but they tend to be very regional. They tend to just be a few days at a time. And they also tend to be just a few SKUs around the store. A lot of people ahead of a blizzard or ahead of a hurricane do not stock up on things like meat and produce because they don't know if they're going to have power. So both the duration of it, the fact that it was throughout the entire country, and the fact that it really wiped out shelves throughout the store is something that we have never seen before. So let's have a look here at another thing that really changed, and that is e-commerce. E-commerce had been trending up quite nicely, but we also knew that meat wasn't part of the basket all that often. So it was very interesting to see that right as the shelter-in-place measures started, that's when e-commerce started to just gear up incredibly quickly. Don't know if you personally experienced it, but within a matter of days, stores started running out of slots, and sometimes you had to wait a week, or sometimes there simply was nothing available at all. And even Amazon-owned Whole Foods had to put people on wait lists. But more than anything, what changed in e-commerce over the last few weeks is the fact that first of all, it was very much skewing towards younger people before the pandemic. Now we have a lot of boomers involved as well, and seniors involved as well, because they're looking to avoid that store and all of a sudden started to order groceries online. We saw that different regions started to get involved. So e-commerce was very prevalent among the East and the West Coast, but now we're seeing it really anywhere in the country as well. We're seeing people also go to brands directly, and this is very prevalent in the meat space. So if you're a packer processor on the line with us today and you've been looking into e-commerce, this is absolutely the time to engage. And also through the grocery channel, it is the time to engage, because more than ever, people do order meat online now. And the whole demographic makeup, the whole growth, we have basically jumped 5 years ahead in terms of where e-commerce sits compared to where we thought it would sit. So the whole idea of that omni-channel approach to marketing and merchandising is absolutely more important than it's ever been. So now how does that overlay relative to meat? So we saw these enormous spikes in grocery in general. So let's have a look at what happened in the meat department these last couple of months. You guys lived it behind the scenes. And this is the next few slides are going to show what happened from a larger perspective within the grocery channel. But I wanted to start off with the same way I started off that speech in Nashville. And that was the fact that as an industry, we have been seeing so much pressure on consumer media hammering away on the meat industry. We're not healthy, we're not doing the right thing in animal welfare, and oh, the environment. And if you leave it up to the consumer media, it seems that nobody is eating meat anymore. And that's why I wanted to start off today with the people providing their own descriptions of how they eat. As you can see, vegan, vegetarian combined this year came in at 4%. It's a little lower than I typically see, but I've seen it for 15 years, right around 5% of the population. Personally, I am not at all concerned about the vegetarians and vegans. It tends to be a phase, and people tend to move back into eating meat as they grow a little bit older. The group I'm more concerned about are the flexitarians. So by purpose of the survey, we called those folks people who try to eat plant-based a lot and integrated meat and poultry maybe 2 or 3, 4 days a week. So not as often as the true meat eater. So I call that my swing voter. And I think as an industry, it's really, really important, just like in politics, to focus in on our swing voters, for the reason being that a lot of these people have three areas that they struggle with relative to meat consumption. And that is meat healthy? Is the animal welfare okay? Is it done in a way where I support it? Am I not doing something bad? So that whole idea of guilt, and then the environment. So those are three areas that continue to come back among those flexitarians, among people that like to eat meat substitutes, as well as people that like to cut back on their meat in the next couple of years. So those are three areas: health, planet, and animal welfare, that we really have our marching orders for in terms of trying to bring back. But of course, by far, the biggest number here on the screen is I am a meat eater, 81% of the population. And that means that eating meat is absolutely still the norm. And it's this much still the norm. So what you see here is the circle on your left represents the sales of meat across retail stores, and the circle on your right represents plant-based meat alternatives. So in case you can't find it, let me overlay here the numbers. 84 billion, and what that includes is not just the meat department, but also the meat sold through the deli case, the meat sold in center store, really everything across the store. And same for plant-based meat alternatives. So they're not quite 1 billion. This is the 2019 numbers, about 0.8 billion. So a whole lot less. So, if you look at the percentages of people who say they're meat eaters versus flexitarians versus vegans, vegetarians, this all adds up quite nicely in the numbers as well. So this is where we started off pre-pandemic. Our 52-week growth leading all the way up to the end of February was fairly flat in pounds, up slightly, nicely, I would say, about 1% in dollars. And interestingly, even though the consumer media absolutely believes that beef would be the one to go first, beef was actually the strongest performer in 2019, as well as that early part of 2020. Chicken also had quite a good year, up in dollars and in pounds. Those were the only two areas that had seen dollars and pound growth. Then pork, turkey, and some of the others had either a mixed performance early in the year or a little bit of pressure on both dollars and volume. Now, processed meat did not do as well as fresh meat, but still also a little bit of growth, nice growth in dollars, and a little bit of pressure in pounds. So now here is what happened throughout the pandemic. So you remember the line there where we looked at total edibles, so anything food in the store, and now look at meat. We just peaked even higher above that. The gentleman in the video talked about the incredible effort that went into keeping the supply going. And that's, to me, what we need to see behind this line. This is not just the year over year growth by week, which is incredible. If you look at that same week of March 15 and the week of March 22nd, the fact that we were able to grow sales by 80 and 92% is just unbelievable. That was dollars. The line in blue is volume. So there too, we're seeing incredible additional poundage moving through the system. Now move a little bit forward into April and May, and you see those lines starting to slope down a little bit with the occasional spike. The occasional spike tend to be the holidays. So we had Easter on April 12th. The week that was off, that was because Easter 2019 fell on 4/19. But then you kind of see that slope down. So every single week that was a non-holiday week saw that everyday demand coming down a little bit. So it was a kind of a little bit of a slow march back to normal. Then you see the big spike for Father's Day, which fell on June 21st. And then a little bit of a spike for Independence Day as well, where we saw some very nice dollar gains. Now, the week that I was not able to cram on here, but I do have the numbers for, is the latest week in July, which was July 12th. And that's really when a lot of the COVID cases started to rise again across the country. And lo and behold, that we saw that everyday demand spike yet again. So it just really seems that not only the early weeks were controlled by the virus, but we continue to see meat at retail really controlled by what is happening around the country in terms of the number of COVID cases at the very least. So here is what the pandemic period looked like. Beef, as I mentioned earlier, was not only the strongest in 2019 and early 2020, but beef was also the strongest throughout the pandemic. You'll see the numbers here in a little bit as to how many dollars and how many pounds those percentages translate into. But overall, during that pandemic period, from March 15 onward to July 5th, we grew dollar sales by 36% and we grew pounds by 23%. That is unbelievable. Other trends that we saw was that processed meat moved right along with fresh meat. Production claims did really well. Everything in the meat department was moving. And as you can see, some of the biggest winners were beef and pork. But at the same time, when the big three started to be out of stock, we saw engagement with a number of cuts and proteins that we hadn't really seen before. So we saw a lot more people engage with things like lamb, turkey, bison. And I think that is actually going to pay off big time for our industry down the road. If you think about the fact that people now have been cooking different cuts and kinds than they were always avoiding in the past because they were afraid to do so, not knowing. So here is what that translates into in terms of the dollars and the cents and the pounds. As you can see, this is just how big beef is compared to the rest. If you look at the additional numbers of dollars and pounds that moved through the system, it was an additional 3.2 billion for beef, about 1 billion for chicken, 770 million for pork. So that's why those I call the big three. Because if you look at some of the others, certainly they saw huge growth percentages as well, but it was over a much smaller base. So when you look at the actual dollars and pounds, it's a little bit lower than the big three on your left. Now, what was very important is it wasn't just the same old meat buyers buying more. We really grew every which way in which you can grow sale. We had more people coming to the store buying meat. They were spending more per trip, they were spending more per household, and they were taking more meat trips all throughout the pandemic. So this is really how meat showed that we're still king of the castle as far as the protein category is concerned. And it really was a positive experience for every single one of these areas. It was also a very big experience for every single one of the regions. In blue, you see the growth percentages for the 52 weeks leading up to that very late February, right before the pandemic became big throughout the United States. And in that darker green, you see the percentage growth throughout the pandemic. As you can see, region here, the Southeast has been doing extremely well. The Southwest has been doing extremely well. Growth percentages of well over 40%. And really, there's no one region that fell off the cliff in terms of growth. So really, growth was fantastic and in unprecedented levels that we've ever seen throughout the entire country. But of course, we also saw that big difference between volume and pounds, or between volume and dollars, and that difference became bigger and bigger as the pandemic moved on. Well, it had everything to do with supply, as the gentleman in the video talked about earlier. And as you can see here, the total meat price per volume was about $3.56 in March 1st. Now look at that blue line of how fast it changes versus a year ago. And we peaked at the end of June at an average price, so this is across cuts, across proteins, of $4.16. And consumers were noticing this. I have the access to a lot of stores, consumer feedback after they take trips. And I'll tell you, there were a lot of consumers complaining about the meat price, but at the same time, there was a level of understanding as to what was going on. And that was something I've not seen before. Typically, people just complain about costs being high. In this particular case, consumers really seemed to understand of what the supply chain was going through and understood that prices were going up, but at the same time, they're struggling to meet their budgets at the end of the month. And if you think about it, what plays into that as well is the fact that normally during non-pandemic times, about a third of all meat sales is sold through promotions. So whether this is a meat markdown or something that is just happening in the store or something that was promoted into circular, meat promotions are incredibly important, pushing about a third of all meat dollars. How people these days look at meat promotions is mostly in store. So now if you overlay the fact that we had a very hard time having enough supply to run meat specials in our circulars, to run meat specials in home with higher everyday prices, this whole idea of consumers feeling that they're paying a whole lot more for their meat now than they are in the past is something that we're going to have to address, especially keeping in mind that the other side of the virus is the fact that we have a lot of economic pressure for a lot of us across the United States in terms of unemployment, in terms of furloughs, in terms of just seeing income disappear after several years of a very strong economy. So the whole idea of pricing is going to be a big discussion going forward. But we also made that sale happen with a whole lot fewer items in store. And that's something quite unique because this whole idea of having new SKUs and a lot of SKUs in store had become quite popular over the last couple of years. In a typical month, you can see that by March 1st, we have about 335 items in the average meat case. And of course, due to the tightness in the supply chain, those numbers started to drop extremely fast. And the lowest week of all of them was the very end of May when we had only about 270 items. So that was 60 items less than we normally have. That was where all those pictures came in of completely empty meat cases. Grocery stores were implementing just buying a few items per transaction, sometimes two, sometimes three. Sometimes that was limited to just beef and pork. Sometimes that was just meat transactions overall. But as we can see how fast this meat case is changing, now beef and pork are doing okay, but now it's chicken that is starting to fall off because they adjusted production early on in the pandemic. And we're seeing inflation rise in chicken now, as well as the number of items being a little bit pressured there as well. As of the week of July 6th, chicken items are down about 5 per store. So here are some of those pictures. I'm sure you've all seen them either as grocery stores here on the line with us today or as consumers. But what it led to is even though people came to the store to buy meat and poultry, our number of dollars per trip were actually down for the simple reason that people were forced to just buy 2 or 3. So the shortages by and large are resolved, and hopefully, even though the virus is tuning up in a lot of different states and people are going back to the grocery store, I don't expect to see these kinds of empty shelves again. But certainly I think we've learned a lot of lessons throughout the supply chain during these times, and absolutely looking through those, looking back, what we can learn from them going forward will be extremely important. So let's take a quick deep dive into meat claims and seafood and some of the other areas as well. So this is what meat claims, and what I mean with that is everything that wasn't just conventional meat. So things like organic, grass-fed, all natural, antibiotic claims, sustainably grown, all these different things. A very small percentage of the market when everything's said and done. The huge meat department sales, by and large, are still driven by conventional meat, 81.5%, and about 18.5% are claims. Now, the bars on the right of each of these areas represent what percentage of the new dollars, so what percentage of the growth did they represent. So if you look at conventional, even though it's 82%, let's round it up, of sales, they represent 65% of growth. Whereas if you look at claims-based meat in 2019, it was about 19% of sales, but 35% of dollars. So it absolutely has been an area of growth for many years. 2019 was no exception, and the pandemic was no exception as well. And that is because a lot of shoppers are looking for attributes when they're looking for meat and poultry. Doesn't mean they're looking for it each and every time, doesn't mean they're looking for it for every single species. But we are seeing that antibiotic-free is one of those highly desired items, in addition to no or added hormones, all natural, grass-fed, also sought out by 5 in 10 shoppers. 4 in 10 are looking for no antibiotic ever. So if you look at that antibiotic space, that is just a really big space that gathers a lot of interest among a very wide audience. US raised is a big one as well, looked for by 4 in 10 consumers, and then free range pasture raised also 4 in 10. And from there, it starts to drop off a little bit. One I wanted to point out, we'll look at it here in a minute, is organic. It has a very hardcore fan base, but it's also a little bit narrower than that of grass-fed, antibiotic-free, etc. So let's look at some of these and how they did pre-pandemic as well as during the pandemic. You see that about 35% want no antibiotics when shopping for meat. And the 52-week, that's the top line of the table, shows that all the areas of antibiotic claims, so this includes antibiotic-free, no antibiotics ever, etc. They were growth areas across all these different species. Now, if you look at the second line, that shows pandemic growth. So incredible percentages. A lot of them are a little bit higher than the conventional because it's off a smaller base. And if you look at the shares, the pre-share and the pandemic share, some increased a little bit. That was turkey and beef. Some decreased a little bit. That was chicken and pork. For the simple reason that at certain times people just bought what was there, but certainly interest in all these areas was there all throughout the pandemic. It was also there all throughout the country. So if you look at pre-pandemic, again, the numbers in blue, we saw very high growth in California and the Southeast. Some areas were a little bit more flat, some were even down, but then throughout the pandemic, the whole antibiotic claims became huge, especially in the Northeast. Look at that number, 52% compared to some of the other areas. So again, the shares did not necessarily change, but very big percentages. So certainly this is an area that people continue to look for. Same for organic here, the percentage growth and dollar share, same as what we just looked at. So organic is just a little bit less important than some of the other claims, but has a very hardcore following. And what we're seeing here is that the growth percentages were extremely high. The only one that is a little bit different is pork, and I'll point out there that organic pork is just a very small sliver of total pork sales. And that's why we tend to have these wild swings going up and down, both in volume and in dollar percentages, because that base is so small. But by and large, organic either held or increased their share throughout the pandemic. So big interest there as well as throughout the country. As you can see here, nice interest all throughout. So let's look a little bit about plant-based meat alternatives. Credit where credit is due. These are some very big percentages, but as you've heard me say a few times now, a lot of that has to do too with the fact that this is still a very small pie. Think back to those enormous circle for meat and that little pinprick for meat alternatives. So that's why some of these percentages are so high. It is a growth area. I don't think it is an area that is going to affect meat sales a whole lot. They seem to be happening hand in hand. They seem to be drawing younger shoppers to our meat department, which is a good thing. And more than anything, we see a lot of the sales moving from frozen to refrigerated. So to an extent, they're cannibalizing from one to the other. And it's not really, as we saw earlier, due to the growth rates, it's not really affected the meat purchase at all. So here is that share. And in case you're wondering that I perhaps left off the meat alternatives, this is the same exact issue as we had with the big ball and the pinprick. If you look at the weeks of March 15 and 22nd, you can see the meat alternative share a little bit there. So it's there, it's just very, very small compared to meat sales. The dotted line represents if you combine meat and plant-based alternative sales, what percentage of sales does it make up? So as you can see throughout the pandemic, it has hovered between 0.5% and 0.7%. So it hasn't really gained share, similar as what we saw for organic, for claims, for all these other areas. Because meat came on so strong, these kinds of growth percentages just fell right in line when you looked at absolute dollars, absolute volume. And the one thing I will point out is the fact that it's 0.7% of dollars, 0.3% of pounds, but 5.2% of packages. So it does, in my opinion, seem a bit overspaced. And what did retailers take out that could have been selling, if you think about it? So this whole idea of right sizing, I think, is going to happen post-pandemic. And at least I wouldn't be surprised. So let's look at a few others, starting with value added. So that is anything that is like pre-marinated, kebabs, meatballs, etc. As you can see, this was pre-pandemic, a little bit of a mixed performance. Beef did well, pork did well, but chicken and turkey value added had a little bit of negative pressure there on dollars. Well, here you see the value added percentages throughout the pandemic, and we see some very strong positive lines here. Again, unprecedented growth for this segment of the market. They held share right around that between 9 and 10% of total dollars. And very strong performance for both pork and turkey in terms of value added. If we think now, we fast forward from the beginning of the pandemic to now, Americans aren't used to cooking at home every meal, every day. So a lot of Americans are struggling with what to make because they've gone through their favorite recipes, I don't know how many times. So this whole idea of value added, promoted in circulars, and really put it front and center, because people will be looking for convenience over the next few months more than they have over the past few months. So I expect these numbers to go up even further. Grinds have been doing extremely well. And if we go back to that knowledge gap I talked about earlier, grinds are a beautiful, versatile cut. It's easy to prepare. You can make burgers out of it, put it in different sauces. So beef, pork, turkey, everything has trended tremendously well. It continues to trend tremendously well. So this continues to be an area of growth, and it's an area of very high engagement all throughout. Same for processed. There had been a lot of pressure on processed meat in the last few years. And as you can see here, there was just some areas. Look at that one on your far left, the smoked ham and pork, up 236%. Now, in part, of course, that included Easter sales, but still, these spikes are incredibly high for anything from sausage, bacon, hot dogs, with sales levels that we haven't seen before. They continue to trend extremely well. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that children are home from school during those March, April, May months. And we're looking to also cover lunch. We're looking to cover every single meal occasion at our home, which is what's driving some of these more convenience meats. So the other thing I wanted to bring up, which was a big finding in 2019, and that was the fact that a lot of consumers buy a very limited number of cuts. Boomers, not so much. They have a lot more meat knowledge. They feel confident around preparing anything and everything. But if you look at those younger generations, self-described, only 8% of Gen Z said that they buy an extensive variety of cuts and kinds. So in other words, you buy pork and lamb and beef and chicken and everything else in different cuts as well. So this is really a huge barrier, because we can't simply ground up everything and that's all these folks buy. The main reason for that, I've mentioned it a few times, is that meat knowledge and confidence gap. If we looked at, I'm afraid I'll mess it up, that's why I don't buy a whole lot of different cuts and kinds, don't know how it will taste, don't know how to cook it. Look at the differences between the youngest generation in the marketplace, Gen Z and boomers. That is unbelievable. And it is also a huge call out for, regardless of where you sit in the meat industry, to start educating people, provide tips, get your best griller behind the barbecue, create some social media. The more we can bring our enthusiasm and knowledge to these younger generations, the better it will be. Because think about this, the second highest reason for these generations to buy plant-based meat alternatives is not because they like the taste of it, it's because it's easy to prepare. So not only is their meat knowledge a barrier to buying across different cuts and kinds, but it's also a reason to buy plant-based meat alternatives because it's easy. So what happened throughout the pandemic is that was not one single cut had a third of all dollars spent. And what you see here is that, of course, ground beef was still in a lot of baskets, but all these different cuts were in people's baskets, in part because that was all that was there at times, but in part because people finally started experimenting as well. And I think this is going to have big, big implications going forward. There were some companies that were looking at what was selling at Amazon, and they saw a 6,000% increase in the purchase of basic cooking utensils. 90% of people said that they were making the vast majority of meals at home. They invested in appliances and tools and hot air fryers and all these different things. So I think this is a big win for our industry. We're seeing people spend more, they're more engaged, and they're buying a greater variety of meat. This I wanted to share with you. This is from Canada Beef. If you look at what people look for in beef, it is the oven roast know-how. It's not ground beef if you look at the numbers compared to one another. So this is really underscoring yet again that if we help people with what they consider these harder to do items, then we can really win as an industry. And you can overlay this on pork, on lamb, on anything. It is helping people feel more comfortable. We see a lot of reaction of that within the industry, a lot of innovation, bringing in Instant Pots and making Instant Pot kits. These are all great ways to make sure that people don't let lack of knowledge stand in the way of purchasing meat. So what is ahead? Let's look at a few of those. Well, I wanted to point out that in today's market, it is still the boomer consumer. And if you look at $100 spent on meat, it is still the boomer consumer that spends $35 of it. So they still rule what happens in the meat case. Now, before you panic about that millennial number, regardless of the category I look at, whether it's candy or produce or meat, this is pretty much how it stacks up. The bottom lines that just zoomed in is the total food dollar. So millennials put off having a family that just resulted in still smaller households, which is why their spending is a little bit lower. Now, if we look at growth versus who spends today, that's when you see the millennials really gearing up. They present 54% of total growth. Their growth is 2.4 times higher than average. So trying to understand how you cater to the day shopper, as well as how do you get that millennial involved with that increased knowledge, with the love for me that generations before them had, that is going to be crucial. Now, I talked earlier about what I call my 3 triangles of guilt, being animal welfare, health, and planet. Talk about health as much as possible, get dietitians involved, talk about the protein, talk about all the nutrients, but also talk about animal welfare and planet. If we look at people who feel this triangle of guilt little thing here, they tend to move to claims-based meat. They also want to eat less of it. They want to avoid certain kinds that they feel are worse than others, but it also prompts them to eat more plant-based. So when we asked, well, what do you think about livestock raised in the US? Do you think it's good? Do you don't know? Do you think it's not? And if you look again at the difference between Gen Z and boomers, you see that there is an enormous higher percentage of Gen Z believing that livestock raising in the US is not good at 40% versus 17% of boomers. This is alarming. And we need to start talking about all the ways in which we care and love for our animals. And they have to understand that the documentaries they're seeing is just one side of the story. It's also incredibly important, regardless of where you sit, this is really a joint exercise. Provide information because people are looking for it. 68% of consumers say they want to hear from their grocery store about animal welfare of the meat they sell. 55% want to hear from the meat and poultry brands. So no one is not involved in this in the mind of the consumer. This is a joint process. Only 36% say there's sufficient information available, and they say put it on pack, put it on your website, whether you're a grocery store or a brand. Put in an in-store signage. We want to know about animal welfare. And if you think about the fact that that was an area why we were starting to lose people to plant-based or just simply eating less, this is an area that we can address, and some are addressing. Here you see some examples on your left, an example of Nolan Ryan beef that has all sorts of in-store signage on unrivaled commitment to animal welfare, or just simply talking about U.S. ranches with ample grazing room, superior genetics, and low stress environment here on the right in one of the store signages. Here you see some examples from across the pond, England. In Europe, I will tell you, this has really become an area of competition where stores call out everything they're doing. And one of the main things they're doing is saying we do business with people we know and trust. So this whole idea of ramping up the relationships with the retailer and really being transparent to the consumer and the entire supply chain is incredibly important. Here you see that best retailer in Europe. This is based on animal welfare. We're not anywhere near that here in the US, but if you look at all the Western countries around us, this is gearing up extremely fast. The other thing that plant-based meat alternatives are really hammering away on is their environmental sustainability. In Germany here, you have a month that they call Veganuary. That's January, and the three areas are exactly the three areas that we've seen. It's better for you, it's better for the animals, better for the planet. That's why you should go vegan for a month, is what Europe is saying. So we asked, and do you think planet-wise, do you think ranchers are taking measures to minimize the environment? And yet again, you see that a lot of people simply say, I don't know, 38%. And the I don't think they are is higher among flexitarians. Again, a call to action for them to eat less meat because they believe it's not good for the planet. So this is really an area where I think one of our key takeaways is, you know, if we as an industry can address the meat, the plant, the planet, the animal, and health, we have a big upside, because COVID-19 did really point out that meat is still the norm in a lot of different households. A lot of upside in terms of meat affinity and knowledge. You know, people will have cooked cuts and kinds that they hadn't cooked before. They realized how much they enjoyed it. A lot of people did more scratch cooking, a lot more e-commerce. So there is a lot of different ways our industry can start engaging with these consumers. And I will tell you, everything that I'm seeing in terms of engagement, if we can get ranchers, processors, anybody, the butcher, involved with social media or with outreach, that is exactly what consumers are looking for. If you look at the statistics of when a rancher or a butcher gets on social media compared to other posts, it tends to be 2 to 5 times more engagement. So hopefully this is a big call out to action, because as we heard this morning, we put a lot of effort into delivering safe, nutritious, great tasting products that are produced humanely and sustainably. And it's incredibly important for consumers to hear more about that. So guys, that was my last slide. Not sure if there were questions, but I'll stop sharing and turn on my camera. And over to you, Joe.
Anne-Marie, thank you for a very informative presentation. We do have a couple of questions, and Lacey will pose those to you.
Yeah, so we have a couple of questions in regards to consumer claims. The first question being, the no antibiotic ever and antibiotic-free preferences seem high. Do consumers really understand it, or is it just claim trendy?
Do they really understand it? Absolutely not. But if you look at where their own medical community has been hammering away, it's been on the overuse of antibiotics. So anybody with kids right now deals with doctors who don't really want to prescribe antibiotics that easily. And so from a whole human world, antibiotics has been demonized a little bit. So the minute it started appearing on packages of meat, and I've had many focus groups with consumers about this, it actually turned into, if they don't see it on the package, they believe it is in there. And I actually had a mom of 3 in a focus group tell me, oh, you know, all meat used to be antibiotic free, but now you need to look for antibiotic free meat, because if it doesn't say it on there, it is in there. And if I cannot find antibiotic free meat, I will just buy eggs or something else. So this is really an area where consumer understanding is absolutely not there. But at the same time, it's one of those where we put ourselves in the position where consumers are now looking for it.
Next question. To what extent is the growth of production claim products due to overall meat availability in the case?
So I have a new survey in the field. So in a few weeks, I'll be able to tell that a little bit better because I was curious too. I mean, we knew people at some point were simply buying what was there, right? I walked into a Costco. There were literally only two cuts of meat. It was rack of lamb and beef ribs. That was it. That was all you could buy. So we know that some people bought things that they wouldn't necessarily had on their list or bought normally. However, if you look at the growth line, if you look at the shares, right? So obviously, because claims-based meat is so much smaller, you see these enormous growth percentages. But if you look at it as a percentage of conventional, it trended very nicely. It was still the same kind of percentage. So there are some claims that have been real popular. It has been an area of growth. But I will caution to say that there's a lot of people who are simply looking for animal protein that do not care about these claims. And so it's very important to understand who shops at the store, who is looking for what, and to really make sure that people understand the claims so we don't have another antibiotics on our hands where people believe they're looking for one thing and really they're looking for something else. So I think claims can be important to some people, but our job as an industry is really explaining what they mean as well as possible.
Next question. Has plant-based grown more in Europe?
So plant-based meat alternatives started a whole lot earlier in Europe. They got a bigger foothold. We also have to keep in mind that some of the animal activists there are extremely, extremely powerful. And I'll talk about my native Netherlands. There, they started going after chicken probably about 8-9 years ago. And it started off with everywhere you went, like the bus stations, magazines, TV, everywhere. They had these posters that showed this miserable, huge chicken that was packed and just looked bad. And they said, you know, this is your conventional chicken. And then they showed this beautiful, tiny little organic chicken. And it was 7 weeks side by side. And basically they started showing people, you know, the difference between the two. Then the whole public naming and shaming started. And they said, this store that you go to can only sell this chicken at $2.99 a pound because it was raised this way. And they really started to bring it home for people. I will tell you, within 3 years, the chicken industry there had to completely change. And you now see on packages where that chicken is still, the regular chicken is still sold, but it will say on the package that there is other options available. And it will actually have this whole grid in the store that shows what brand had how much space per chicken, how long they lived, all these different things. And so people have this whole grid for pork, for chicken, of how they can sell. So all that said, that led to plant-based meat alternatives spiking a whole lot earlier than they did here. But even there, interestingly, as much as the Dutch government and other governments would like to see it, meat has not suffered at all. Meat sales and meat consumption per capita are as high as they've always been.
Next question. Have you seen food service drop off by the same amount as retail meat sales has risen?
So food service sales are a lot harder to track. I don't have as much view on it, but for all of you that have been able to find the weekly reports we're doing, keep an eyeball on those, because Christine with Rabobank has been providing some food service updates as well. But yes, absolutely. When we saw those huge spikes is pretty much when all the restaurants started closing down, and they had a lot of movement into systems. In talking to a lot of the broadline distributors, they said that they ran at about 30% capacity for many, many months. They geared up to about 70-80%. But now, of course, a lot of the populous states are closing restaurants back down. So I wouldn't be surprised if those percentages are going back down. So, you know, a lot of consumers don't understand. They hear about milk being dumped. They hear about, you know, they see empty shelves in the meat case, and they're like, how can that be? You know, there must be. But, you know, obviously a lot of factories or plants just process for food service, and you can't also easily turn that over. So what the exact percentages are, I don't know, but certainly they dropped way down. Yes.
All right, well, that was a great presentation, and we are.
Yeah, we're out of time for now. We still got a couple questions left. We can get those answered offline maybe. But
Yeah, absolutely. Email them to me, and I will make sure to answer them.
Great. So thank you again so much, and we're going to move on with the program. We got a short message from our host and one of our sponsors, and before our next speaker.
Thank you.
My name is Jake Watts. I'm the Vice President of Food Safety at PSSI. Without a doubt is the safety of our team members, period. Ensuring that we've got a safe, clean environment where our customers continue to effectively produce product and feed the nation. We've taken a look at social distancing throughout the facility and doing some pre-screening prior to team members arriving at the facility to start their work. We're utilizing face coverings and then ultimately following CDC guidelines. When you talk about 17,000 employees, the key that we found out is you have to just continue that training down through the organization. Just don't touch on it today and not come back to it. We send out a COVID-19 email blast every day that has a lot of the big topics for the day that may have came out from either FDA, USDA, CDC, and that's been helpful as well. Got a 5-year-old. You know, usually we're so professional, and it's been nice when we're on conference calls or having meetings and hearing other people's children in the background. And, you know, a lot of times you kind of see they're maybe a little embarrassed, but that's really been a great part of it. I've been really humbled of the commitment of our team members to truly be there as critical infrastructure workers, making sure that the nation's food chain and the supply is there when we need it the most.